Taking some time.
Take your time.
Yeah. Stuck on preparing.
It now shows as live on YouTube.
Is it live on the YouTube?
Hold on. Yes.
Is it live on the YouTube? I can even hear myself. Anyways, so without further ado, hello everyone, and welcome to SIB-Groningen, the Dutch United Nations Student Association. I hope you'll all enjoy today's lecture, our online alternative to the Diplomats Dinner. Although a select few of you won't be able to meet different diplomats, instead all of you will be able to meet Dr. Bronner, an expert in civilian diplomacy and an academic with quite the illustrious career. Dr. Eric Bronner is the co-director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue and Board of Governors. He has previously organized intimate discussions with diplomats and leading politicians, including President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, former Presidents Khatami and Ahmadinejad of Iran, former President Numieri of Sudan, and the late Yassir Arafat of the PLO, as well as several institutes and individuals advising on such policy. He's written well over 200 articles, several books, all of which have been translated into well over a dozen languages, among which Peace Out of Reach, Middle Eastern Travels, and the Search for Reconciliation, and Reclaiming the Enlightenment Towards a Politics of Radical Engagement. This Monday, he'll be joining us to tell us what he can, and from what he's learned from his wealth of experience, and answer your questions as best he can. So without further ado, let me hand over the word to Dr. Bronner.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor and a privilege, and this is exactly the kind of activity I enjoy. All of you should be very proud, as I said previously. You should all be very proud that you're doing this kind of activity on what's going to be the 35th anniversary of the UN Charter. And before going further, before really going into diplomacy and dialogue, since the UN is the, probably it's fair to say, still the central site for diplomacy and dialogue, it's worth thinking about the UN, I think, and what it's achieved. First of all, I think the UN is not just a single body. The UN is three things. It's, on the one hand, the Security Council, which is a remnant of the idea of the great powers, who can veto what they wish and introduce what they like. The second part is, of course, the General Assembly, where everyone has, every nation, no matter what its size, and the affiliate organizations, such as our ICDD, has the right to speak. And the third part, which is probably the most valuable of the UN, are its agencies. UNRWA, for example, was for many, many years the source of survival for the Palestinians. UNESCO has done work all over the globe to improve the conditions of especially children, and that's true of UNICEF as well. We can go through the World Health Organization, which is probably the only organization which allows for some kind of global interaction on health policy, which of course, in the period of COVID, is a matter of enormous importance. Just a word about the General Assembly. Now, just like these agencies, there's a great deal of compromise, discussion, rivalry, and competition over which kind of policies should be forwarded and which shouldn't. This goes through all three of the agencies. One usually makes fun of, or one often makes fun, especially in the United States, of the General Assembly, that it's just a talking body and a place for polemical expression. I think that's very untrue and very unfair. The General Assembly and the UN in general are cosmopolitan bodies which are hindered by the kind of nationalist and xenophobic attitudes so evident among, shall we say, the new right or the far right in actually each of the major nations who are part of the Security Council. I found that the General Assembly is of great importance for working out international contacts, for learning off the record what people are thinking, what nations are thinking. And I'm almost, I'm tempted to say, and I don't think it's an exaggeration, that the UN couldn't function without it. Let me give you an example of personal contacts in action. About, let's see, it was 2007. I was in Sudan and I was working on the Darfur crisis at that time. And I happened to make friends. I had made friends earlier, but I met again one of the leaders of one of the parties, national parties in Sudan. And we became fairly good friends. And one night he and another person from another party came to me in my hotel and asked essentially whether I knew anyone in the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And I said, well, not anyone with any clout. And he said, oh, too bad. And I asked, well, why is that? Because at that time precisely, Sharia law was being introduced, and the influence of, what was his name again? Hassan Turabi was growing. He was a fundamentalist and connected even to Osama bin Laden through the marriage of one of their children. At any rate, I said, so it was sort of dangerous for them, I thought, for them to bring this up. And I said, what's the deal here? How are you talking? Why are you bringing this up? They said, look, the way things stand now, we're thinking about reaching out to Israel. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, as things stand now, the Palestinians have no meaningful policy, and all they do is cost us money. 10 years later, about 13 years later, what we find is that the Sudanese have indeed reached out their hand. What this shows is one, how long a major policy takes to unfold, but also in a certain way, how important it is we talked about this obviously for an hour or two, how important it is to get feedback from different nations for a policy that any single nation wants to pursue. And this leads me to what I see as the crucial issue right now, in which the UN is implicated. And that is, are we going to follow a multilateral course in international relations, or are we going to fall back into unilateral diplomacy? Multilateralism was really the policy of the United States through most of the democratic administrations. And what it means, of course, is that even if the United States sees itself as standing in the forefront You know, the right word here is, or the right phrase here is primus inter pares, first among equals. There are still equals, and there will still be consultation and coordination of activities in which the United States is engaged. This is of particular importance today in a global society. And what I mean by a global society is literal. You have to imagine going back, let's say in the 1930s, right? There were really, from the standpoint of the great powers, only a half dozen to a dozen nations that counted. Today, of course, there are over 100. And this is, of course, a good thing. In fact, it's a major thing. And in this, and obviously the more nations that are involved in the UN and in international affairs, the more complicated it gets. And the more acting in a unilateral fashion, as I'm afraid our president has continued to do, is sort of like winding up a bull in a china shop. You don't even know what you're wrecking. So, for example, the initiative in the UAE of of opening relations with Israel, which follows, of course, the de facto recognition of Israel by Egypt and Jordan, which took place under the Obama regime. This is an example of unilateral action. And on one level, you can say, this is really a good thing. This has opened up travel. It's set up an important precedent of formal recognition, or precedent for formal recognition. And it's certainly, from the standpoint of Israel, moved it out of its status as a pariah in the international community, which all of you know it has had. In that sense, very good. But there's another side to this, of course, which is really taken into account and has not been taken into account in the unilateral policy forwarded by the United States. Point number one, the Palestinian community is left in complete tatters because of this, attempting to use a global public opinion to pressure Israel on the settlements and on its rather aggressive policies. Now what we find is that kind of foreign policy no longer holds. And there is no plan B. There's no backup. And so there is a major crisis that's been generated within the Palestinian community, which was from the start not unified, as most of you know, in the, shall we say, simmering Cold War between Hamas and Fatah. That's number one. Number two, which I find amazing that it hasn't been brought up, is that the United States decided to buy its support, which it can do. A $350 billion deal for 10 years to Saudi Arabia, and a $35 billion deal to the UAE. Now, it's important to note that this kind of package, it's not as if the United States is giving away anything. These countries are obligated to buy military hardware from the United States. So what's happened, of course, is there has been an explosion of possibilities for serious violence and war that have been generated, especially against the other loser in this deal, which is Iran. And I can tell you that relations have worsened. And since President Trump has embarked on his unilateral policies, which of course have taken time to develop, what you've seen is the far right, the Revolutionary Guards, gaining ascendancy over what was an extremely intelligent and moderate regime run by Rouhani and Sharif, the foreign minister. That wasn't taken into account either. And for Yemen, which I'm working with now, we've already seen the results of this policy, which is increased bombing, I would even say genocidal bombing, and a worsening of relations. Now, any kind of diplomatic activity in which you engage is going to have positives and negatives. There's no doubt about that. The importance of multilateralism is that you have a better chance of working out what the positive and negatives of the original policy are, rather than if you simply do it yourself. And indeed, this plan has also emboldened Israel to, with regard to its settlements, which are clearly not being suspended, and with regard to its general policy of tightening the grip on Gaza and even on the West Bank. Now, when you think of diplomacy and you think of dialogue, which of course the two terms for my organization, it's not exactly the same thing. The way we've interpreted it is the following. Usually when you think of diplomacy taking place, there'll be diplomats at lower levels going over to prepare the way for agreements or diplomacy among higher officials. Notice, basically, there are 2 states, or 3 states, or 4 states involved in the negotiations. And our opinion has been, Eric Goslin, who's my co-director, and I, that this is a very counterproductive way of proceeding. It's counterproductive because, one, it's not true that the people and the state are somehow in direct connection with one another. The interests of the one may not meet the interests of the other. The second reason is because this kind of purely state to state idea of diplomacy, it really doesn't work very well. As was the case in what I just suggested to you. So what we've decided to do, the way we've decided to proceed, is to basically have dialogue precede diplomacy. And that would be discussion amongst the civil societies of the different states. In other words, in any peace agreement in the Middle East, it'll be made by states. What does this have to do with women necessarily, or women's subjugation in the Middle East? What does it have necessarily to do with pushing internal rights, human rights? And I can go on and on like that. But the point is that the reason for the dissonance is that these people, these groups in the particular nations, these associations, they have no representation at the table. So what we tried to do is, first of all, bring about some set of agreements, some agenda for different elements of civil society, in particular nations. We're trying to do that in Pakistan and India at the moment, and work out an agenda of what the people's representatives want to see discussed. Not everything's going to be discussed, but some things will be discussed. And after an agreement is reached among the different groups within civil society, then we take it over to the state. In other words, in our view, it's essential to set up the preconditions for diplomacy through dialogue. And I don't know, as with everything else, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think the chances for it working are better than the way we're proceeding at the moment. Indeed, it seems to me that there are basically three opportunities or three ways of pursuing foreign policy. You can have complete indifference, which is a perfect example of that is what we call basically boredom with genocide. One hears it so often, one sees it so often, people get inured. It's the worst possible standpoint to be in. Or we have diplomats or people in civil society who say, well, you can't do anything anyway, which of course is the best excuse for indifference and doing nothing. Then you have the possibility of dialogue, and then you have the possibility of war. This is something that's rarely appreciated, I fear. Because the truth of the matter is that those who make fun of dialogue or those who make fun of diplomacy in a crisis, they usually have no other alternative than war. The two are the idea of indifference and the belief that nothing can be done, in other words, the belief in war, are fundamentally connected, in my view. And what has this led to? It's led to at least a standpoint of mine in which I think that cynicism is probably probably works like poison on the possibility of pursuing an intelligent foreign relations. Indeed, we are also, if that's true, what I've just suggested, obviously, if you're engaged in dialogue, there's going to have to be some kind of idealism that's brought to bear. You have to be clear about what you want, about your hopes for the future, about how this will affect your nation and how it will impact on other nations. I'm talking about the policy, of course. That shows something beyond indifference. On the other hand, ideals aren't enough. You have to know what you're doing. Realism is an unavoidable part of foreign relations. And everybody says, yes, they're being realistic or they're being pragmatic, but are they? Realism, in my view, means the following. What your aim is in diplomacy is to expel conflicting ideals. What you want to do is reduce the discussions as much as possible to objective interests. And the reason is very simple. You can always compromise on interests, but it's very difficult to compromise on principles, especially in a complex, multilateral, multicultural world. And so if one starts to think about it, in my view anyway, one has to raise the issue of how do we create an interpenetration of idealism and realism, not a little bit of one and a little bit of the other, but some kind of fusion that appears in every crisis. Let me be clear. It's quite true that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, as the realists say. But it's also true that the road to hell is often paved with bad intentions, which speak to the conditions of the realist, the egoism, the concern with domination and power. If somebody asked me, what is foreign policy? What should it look like? Then I would say it is employing the ideals you have, human ideals, those incarnated by the UN, with the knowledge that you gain from educational institutions such as yours, so that you can specify what is objective and what the issues that need to be discussed or need to be compromised objectively in any given crisis. You bring, and that, my friends, is, in my view anyway, the art of politics. There is no science. There is instead an often vain attempt to link the ideals we have with the ambitions we want to pursue. And the extent to which we're self-conscious about that, to that extent, we'll be following a humanistic policy. Thank you very much. Thank you. I see little hands going up. Okay, thank you. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to discuss any of these claims with you.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Dr. Bronner. I'm just going to gather a few at the moment. But yeah, so if anyone has any questions, you can just go ahead, same as usual. Raise your hands. Either turn on your camera and raise your hand and we'll see it, or you can...
much better that way.
Raise your hand through the Zoom functions. If there's no question. Nina, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you first of all for that lecture. And yeah, you hinted a bit at the unilateralism of the current US government when it comes to international relations. And I recently read an article. It was from a very US-centric perspective, but it argued that basically without the US, the UN, as it is right now, would sort of cease to exist if the US just withdraws even further from international collaboration. And I was just wondering what your stance on that is. Would you kind of agree with that, or do you have a different point of view?
Well, it depends. Again, it depends what you mean. If it's a question of how much money is given to the UN, I think it can continue. It may continue in a less effective way for the United Nations to withdraw from UNICEF or from UNESCO or the like, is a humanitarian disaster. There's no other way to say it. Would the General Assembly continue to exist? Sure. And one can even ask, one could even probably say that the Security Council would exist. It existed for many years without a major power like China. And to this extent, to the same extent, one can say, if any of the major powers, and we're talking about China or the United States or arguably Russia, if any of these states were to withdraw, or if the European Union were to, in a consensual way, withdraw from the United Nations, it would collapse as well. You know, but or it would have the same possibility of collapsing. No, I think one has to begin here differently. There is a cost that can be extracted for unilateral decision making, and in a way, it's starting to be done against the United States. Foreign policy is starting to be slowly, because this always takes time, dictated without any real input. For example, on Iran, you know that the United States wishes to ratchet up the sanctions against Iran. And you also know that the European Union wants to do exactly the opposite. And so one winds up in this very strange situation in which each is standing in the way of the other. And what I fear is not so much that any particular institution will collapse as that paralysis will strike in terms of what any particular institution can effectively do. And you see that also with the situation with climate change, you know, particularly, if that answers your question. Does that do it?
Yeah, thank you.
Very good, thank you. Anybody else have anything?
Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask them.
Don't be shy.
But if no one has any, I do actually have a question of my own. Arguably, the highest level of diplomacy takes place in the Security Council. Mm-hmm. Last week, we had the first few opening speeches, I guess you could call them, of the UN 75 General Assembly debates. And among the speakers were Nigerian President Buhari and South African President Ramaphosa, as well as the Angolan president, whose name I currently can't remember, who each called for the UN to be reshaped. I think the keywords from President Ramaphosa of South Africa was that the body does not reflect the world we live in. Do you think there's any possibility for change in the Security Council or the highest leagues of diplomacy for the current great powers to leave their positions of their own accord or to be removed from their positions by those who do not want to see them there?
That's a very good question. I would agree that the UN doesn't meet the, or it doesn't really reflect the planet as it's developed. I think that's pretty obvious. And certainly the Security Council doesn't. But there is a self-serving element to what our three African presidents have said. And that is, if the UN is to be invigorated, then there's going to have to be some incursions on sovereignty. In other words, it has to be given the power to expand, the power to act. And as soon as that issue is raised, everybody sort of steps back. And you can see this in the International Court, for example. The International Court can't act unless nations agree previously to be bound by the decisions of the court, which is, of course, shall we say, a somewhat beneficial stance for someone committing genocide. but at the same, but it shows the problem, I think, very well, and it lays forward a kind of moral imperative for young people, which is to press for the empowerment of the General Assembly and make it more than what it is. Now, with regard to the states on the Security Council, it's an open question. Certainly, domestic politics spills over here. The victory of Donald Trump in our forthcoming election would spell a disaster for the UN. I don't think there's any question about it. It spelled a disaster so far for virtually every other international organization that the United States has been involved in. On the other hand, the extent to which multilateralism is embraced by the great powers might very well open the way to discussion and an exertion of influence by smaller states. And that's possible too. So that's a very good reason why in your domestic elections, you better vote the right way. Yeah, and vote. Does that somehow meet your concerns? By the way, I have to admit, I'm surprised that none of you have asked me about the elections in the States. I would think that that is a crucial element for diplomacy.
I would personally agree, for sure.
Anybody got anything they want to ask? Because there's something I'll put forward to you, if you like. One of the things about unilateral diplomacy is that it's transactional. And by that I mean the famous quid pro quo. You give me something, I give you something. And usually it comes down to money, especially with Donald Trump. This is part of his incredibly weird relationship with Vladimir Putin. And it really is weird. That kind of transactional diplomacy is particularly dangerous because the more transactional it becomes, the more the national interest becomes identified with the person making the transaction. So you have a situation in which Trump really can say, I am the state. Only I can pursue a policy that speaks to the United States. And that's true. If you imagine foreign policy being conducted that way, there's something to it. Of course, it's anti-democratic, but that's a different matter.
The question is whether it will be anti-democratic or...
Yeah, I mean anti-democratic with a little d. You know, yeah, I'll tell you, people there is a malaise in the United States like I've never experienced before. It's really bad, and people are really. You can see it in everyday life, constantly. People are just on edge. There are fights all the time. This is beyond the conflicts in Portland and with Black Lives Matter and so on. It's just people are really on edge. And here you can see a situation where the country gets conflicting signals on COVID and on virtually other issues. And there's a crisis of leadership that spills over into foreign affairs. It's very strange. Yeah. Anyway, anybody else have anything?
Yeah, I see a question from either Luc, Lotte, Bea, Jamal, or Nina.
Hi, it's Luke here. I was just wondering to pick your brain a bit on the seat left vacant by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. in the Supreme Court. And what does that sort of spell out for the future of America if Trump's, well, presumably Trump's nomination will be successful? What do you think that would spell out for future relations on the world stage?
Let me sort of say something that's not very politically correct. There is an element in this whole business which is ignored because Ruth Bader Ginsburg has made a number of important decisions and has been a force behind, of course, abortion rights and so on. The woman had cancer and was sick 4 times before this and under the Obama administration. At the age of sort of 80 or so, it's time to go. And she should have left the court and allowed a Democratic president to make another appointment. I think that's absolutely unconscionable, in my view. Now, having said that, her death obviously opens the way for a conservative appointment, and that conservative appointment is going to be Amy Coney Barrett. And this is a disaster. I mean, this is a woman who could be an Opus Dei, the reactionary Catholic organization. Clearly, a number of things would be on the table. For women, there's no doubt about it that abortion rights are in question. For healthcare, what we have, Obamacare, that's going to be called into question. And this is more relevant perhaps for foreign affairs. The constraints on the president are going to be lessened. In other words, the role of Congress, the role of the Senate are going to undoubtedly be weakened. One can say a lot about Trump. Almost every policy is put forward domestically or internationally has been a disaster. But one thing he clearly did, and it's something of profound importance, he's completely transformed our judiciary. Our judiciary is something we could be proud of, more or less. It was an independent organ of government, and it served as a kind of corrective to the power of the executive and even the power of Congress. Now, what I fear is that both at the federal level, where there have been something like 400 conservative appointments, and at the level of the Supreme Court, where there would be a clear conservative majority, a situation will come about that in which that independence of the court, that ideological independence and institutional independence, is going to be compromised. If Trump wins, then there is a kind of subservience that the judiciary will exhibit relative to him. If he doesn't win, this kind of judiciary will attempt to block every initiative made by our hope to be and soon to be President Biden. So it's a disaster also.
Well,
Does that speak to your concern?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a thorough answer, and yeah, I mean, I'm from South Africa, so I'm not like big into US politics and stuff, but of course it affects the whole world. And for me, especially coming from a more African country, we've always sort of been taught that the US is a bastion of democracy and of independence and free thinking and free thought and sort of trying to be more forward thinking. and the past few years of the Trump administration, and to see what has really unfolded in America, like, you know, racial inequality, pure blatant racism, the sort of backward thinking and isolationist mentality that's going on in America. It's quite shocking to see that when we have been called, quote, by Donald Trump, a shithole country. And then you see kind of what's happening there, and you're like, wow, well, if America is, excuse my French, a bit of a shithole at the moment, where does the world go from here, you know? So it's just a bit of a period of uncertainty, I think, for sure.
I certainly agree with you. And I can tell you from my own experiences with different diplomats and so on. I mean, I don't claim super insight or super connections, but from those that I've met, the United States has become a complete laughingstock to diplomats. That's true with regard to our appointments. People like Mike Pompeo in foreign affairs, who probably knows as much about foreign affairs as I know about astrophysics, and an entire hierarchy of sycophants and people who have bought their way into positions of authority. It's absolutely amazing. And I certainly don't blame especially so much of the rest of the world in which people of color are dominant, from being critical, cynical, and also rendered uncertain by the United States. I mean, the United States was never a savior. I mean, that I think was perhaps a kind of idealization that came from the outside. That's certainly true with Latin America, and the Latin Americans know it. But it's also true that there was a general belief that, as John Rawls put it, there was a certain decency to our country. By the way, The Law of the Peoples is an important book to read by John Rawls. That there's a certain decency which could be expected. You know, at least a willingness to talk, a willingness to see the problems, even if there's a Cold War going on, the problems that are being faced. That's no longer the case. That's clearly no longer the case. And I think the only way that one can move forward in a progressive fashion, I hate to put it this way, is through the European Union and regional organizations like the African Union. There is a strange situation in which one of my favorite philosophers becomes incredibly relevant. And I'm thinking of Hegel, who is, of course, impossible to read. But there really is. There's a way in which the empirical situation and the empirical conflicts and general ideals embodied in the UN, universal ideals, have to be mediated. You have to have some kind of organization that that on the one hand exhibits something more than purely national interest, and on the other hand knows what's going on in its region. And that, I think, is the function of transnational organizations like the UN and the African Union and the European Union. And there's something else in this, and for somebody, this is going to make a great dissertation. I and Eric and some representatives from our organization were in Guinea. And we were invited there by a religious figure Islam Siddiqui, and Suleiman Siddiqui, who I've become fairly friendly with. And he is a chieftain and the leader of a religious movement called Nur Dineh. They speak a language down there which I've never met a non-Guinean who can speak it. Which shows we're sort of divorced from what's happening. At any rate, we landed in Mali, and we made our way across to Guinea, and almost in a straight line. And as we crossed the border of Mali and actually Guinea as well, what we could see is enormous placards, little signs on trucks and so on, proclaiming Nur Dineh. We get to Kankan, which is the main city in Guinea, and we go to we're invited to basically reorganize their university there. That's what we were doing there. There's a celebration that's put forward by Siddiqui and his group. And what we find is that this is a transnational, religious, semi-religious, semi-political, semi-social kind of movement. The president of Guinea wanted to say something. Siddiqui just ordered him off the stage. There were 80,000 people in the audience. We were on the stage. You could hear a pin drop. It wasn't like going to a synagogue where everybody's talking at the same time. No, it was completely silent. And it was one of the most beautiful ceremonies I've ever seen, which we could talk about at another time. The point is, this is another form of transnational organization that needs to be talked about. It's not even taken into account in national discussions over foreign policy. And I'm sure that other forms or other expressions of this same phenomenon are evident in other parts of Africa, and I'm sure in Asia as well. So something to look at for the future. How's that, Luke? Does that do it for you?
Oh yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, definitely, like, there's an African concept of Ubuntu, which is you are who you are because of other people, and it speaks of togetherness. And I really think in this divisive time, it's such an important thing to remember that
Absolutely.
You are who you are because of the people who are around you. And we can't forget that. And I think, especially now on the world stage, we are. And there's so many differences that are being highlighted on a daily basis, which is true. Diversity is so important, but also our common humanity is what unites us. And especially to see what's going on, my country included, we've had a spate of xenophobic violence at the beginning of the year, last year, which is horrible as well. And I speak to my Zimbabwean friends, and we all talk about it, and it's a big problem. But to see it also happening in the US, who, as I said before, is supposed to be a bastion of democracy and forward thinking, is really shocking. And now to see, especially in the Breonna Taylor judgment, what just happened, that a woman's life is worth less than a dry wall is shocking to me. And yeah, I don't really know what to say. I think I'm quite despondent when it comes to America, especially when, as in a more personal story as well, when Nelson Mandela passed away, and there was that big memorial that happened in Johannesburg, and President Obama came and spoke, and to see what an amazing man he was, and how articulate and well thought out and and how he spoke so beautifully of a man who he'd not met many times, you know.
Right.
It was amazing. And then I see a speech of Trump, and the way that he talks is so divisive, and it's just
unbelievable.
100% unbelievable.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my thoughts. But thank you so much. It's been such an amazing discussion to hear an American in this industry speak about what's going on as well.
By the way, Luke, I can tell you that this is exactly what people are talking about in the States.
Yeah.
This difference in one of my old colleagues, a fine political theorist, Benjamin Barber, who also wrote some works on international affairs. He used to bring up the idea of equality of mind. And I like that concept because there you can really judge the difference. I do have one thing, though, I want to say about the States and about foreign affairs, because when I was talking about ideals, I think I left that too abstract. It's a question of what kind of ideals, and I think Luke once again hit this properly. The universal ideals are that you're talking about are essentially embedded in the liberal rule of law, which is of course, a modern product of the Enlightenment. Whatever the prejudices of the philosophers, this is a remarkable intellectual and political achievement. And here I'd like to suggest something to you in this age of diversity. I think the only way that diversity can be freely expressed is if the liberal rule of law is operative, not simply spoken about, but operative. And in other words, commitment to the universal underpins the possibility of expressing the particular, if I can put it in philosophical terms. And what we have in the United States, what unifies all of what's happening, I think, is that the liberal rule of law is becoming increasingly paralyzed and increasingly irrelevant to Republican and Democratic policymakers. That's what would link the kind of criminality of Trump, the unilateral decision-making of Trump, the arrogance of Trump standing above the law. I mean, he said it straight out that the president stands above the law. And he said it that our FBI and our Department of Justice should serve his purposes, not the purposes of the Republic. And so what we have in the United States now is a real crisis of the Republic, as surely as we had close to 150 years ago during the period of the Civil War. I think we can actually talk about a second Civil War being launched.
Stephen, sorry to talk again. It sort of reminds me of apartheid South Africa, the way that Donald Trump speaks, because in those days as well, you know, the president, the prime minister of the country was above the law, and like we were close to a civil war with that. So I can definitely see what you mean, that there's so much unrest in America because as well, just by this whole Black Lives Matter protest movement as well. It's worrying. It is worrying because we don't know necessarily what's going to happen.
I don't know how this comes across to all in Europe. Donald Trump comes from the same area as I do. He's basically from Brooklyn. I'm from Manhattan, but he's from New York City. And how should I put it? There's a certain style he uses. He talks like a mobster, really like a gang member. It's not just that he is a gang member, it's that he shows himself to be a gang member. The cursing, this sort of attitude, I know what's going on. I'm a street guy. You don't know anything. You're just reading your books. I never read a book in my life, but I know what's happening. That kind of talk, that style, it's certainly to me completely abhorrent. And watch for it. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. I did a piece on gangster politics in my new book called The Sovereign. And let's put it this way, I had Trump in mind. But it also fits for somebody like Viktor Orban, or for, what's his name, the president of Belarus, or for any number of crude dictators that were out there, you know? And I don't know, if you analyze the discourse, you usually find out where the sensibility is at. And our sensibility, it's bad. It's really bad. Sorry to be so depressing.
That's realist, I guess.
One has to bring it in occasionally. Yeah.
Of course. I mean,
Anybody else have anything?
Gangster politics, Duterte comes to mind for me. But yeah, of course. Further questions? Anyone? Again, I may have not been very clear with it. I already got a question from one person asking how to raise their hand on Zoom. If you go to participants, click that button and you can see a button to raise your hand. Mart?
Okay, so you talked a bit, might be circling around the same topic. Anyway, right now there's a lot of talk for what if Donald Trump does not want to give up his presidential position, especially since you are, as you power to keep the control, to keep everything. Your Wikipedia page as well, and I know you wrote a lot about Camus, which I really love. So I was really curious, what should the American people do if he tries to keep the power, won't give it up, from a, well, especially from a Camus position, but you also talked about Hegel, so that makes sense as well, to a certain degree. So I was just curious what you thought about that.
That's a very good question. I actually just finished a piece, which for once, I don't know where to publish. It's too radical for the liberal journals, and it's not radical enough for the radical journals. But it's called After the Vote, and it deals with exactly this question. It's important to understand that the suppression of the vote, which of course Donald Trump is relying on, trying to strangle the post office from delivering ballots, the idea of invalidating mail-in ballots. This is a very old tactic that has its roots in the post-Civil War society and the Ku Klux Klan, to be perfectly frank. The first thing that the resurgent South did after the Civil War, that the Ku Klux Klan basically did after the Civil War, was strip Black Americans of voting rights. And so on the one hand, this is a very accepted custom, especially in the South, for its white citizens and for white organizations. On the other hand, for Black citizens, the vote is a great treasure. They fought for it, they died for it, they organized for it. This was at the center of the civil rights struggle. And I don't think they're going to give it up so fast, in my view. It seems to me that what might very well happen is that President Trump will try to invalidate these mail-in ballots, as they're called. He will try to get the Supreme Court to support him. And he will try and remain in office, literally not leave. Now, everybody has talked about the fact, this can't happen. If he stays, we're gonna send in troops to pull him out. Maybe they will, but I'm not so sure that the Republican Party will support that kind of action against Trump. And that is the danger. The possibility of violence in the streets, I'm sorry, I didn't know the name of the young man who raised the question, correctly put it. That's a real possibility. Now, I think he'll be thrown out at the end of the day. If this is given that he loses, because he's going to make the argument that the election is invalid. If he loses, if he wins, of course, it's completely fair. But if he loses, that's going to be the argument, because ballots have been mailed in under the conditions of COVID. You can imagine that's necessary, especially for poor people. And I think, this is clearly an attack on people of color. Trump has been consistent in his endorsement of white nationalism. I mean, there's just no question about it. He doesn't even deny it. And this is another way of that playing out. But the possibility of violence is real. And I don't know what to say beyond that, other than that the Democratic Party and Democratic leadership had better create some kind of popular front of organizations to oppose what might happen. Because as you know, as a political person, you always have to fear the worst. I hope that speaks to your concern.
Thank you. I hope that answered your concerns indeed, Mart. We now have a question from the YouTube chat. Something on a totally different matter. Tom Gerhardt would like to know what you consider to be your biggest achievement.
Personally, what am I most proud of? It's hard to say. I'm particularly proud of being the recipient of that Middle East Peace Prize. But I don't know. The thing I guess I'm most proud of is that I've tried to do things. I mean, especially in diplomacy and the like, you lose more often than you win, and it takes an awful lot to do a little bit. And I think that's the only way we can judge ourselves. Have we done the best we can to further the principles in which we believe? And that I don't have many regrets. I'm also very proud, I have to tell you, of my students. I put through about 50 people did dissertations with me, half women, half men. And they've taken on, they've become fine teachers. Many have become fine scholars. Some of you may know Micheline Ishai, who wrote the standard book on the history of human rights, or Manfred Steger, who's sort of the rock star of globalization. And I've had a number of students like that. I've been very lucky. And so as a teacher, and I guess as a scholar and a diplomat, I tried to do the best I could and push my ideas stand by my principles as well as I could. And I don't think and I guess the other thing I'm fairly proud of is that I think I was willing to adapt to the times without sacrificing my principles too much, if that happens, if that helps.
Yeah. Again, I hope that answers your question, Tom.
It's a kind question, by the way. I appreciate that.
I also still got a message from Mart, who wanted to thank you for answering his question. His internet crashed. And now I think Luc, or Lotte, or Bea, or Jamal, or Nina has had their question raised for quite some time again.
It's all right.
My name's Jamal. First of all, thank you so much for your time, and it was a very interesting talk. My question is, in the recent few months, or let's say recent years of the Trump presidency, we've seen some spectacular failures and some, I would say, spectacular wins on the foreign policy front, especially recently with relations with Israel. And how do you see this region, Israel and its neighbors, after the US elections, in the case that I would assume if Trump wins, we will see the same sort of direct diplomacy that he's known for, let's say. And in the case of Biden winning, how do you see that? Do you see it slowing down, or do you see it as something that's independent from domestic politics for the USA? What's your opinion on that?
I don't think foreign affairs is ever completely independent of domestic policy. That's because the president wishes to either leave a legacy or be or regain power after the next election, and the State Department tries to follow his lead. I think the biggest difference is going to be there'll be a more multilateral approach than under Trump. I don't think there's any question about that. I think the United States will go back into the Paris agreements, the Paris Accords, sorry. There'll be an improvement of relations with the European Union because of the multilateral approach. It seems to me that there'll be a new affection, if I can put it that way, for the United Nations, a new sensibility in that regard. And I think there'll be sort of a more reasonable tone employed. I would think that there would be an attempt to recreate the nuclear treaty with Iran or some version thereof. And the only place I don't know what would happen, I really have no idea, is with the great failure of all our administrations, which is Korea. And to be perfectly frank, I don't know enough about it. This is not my sphere of knowledge. But I think in all those ways, there'll be an improvement. I think also there'll be a more predictable kind of policy, more reliance on objective concerns, less reliance on personal interactions between leaders, which is what Trump builds on. I mean, that's a very dangerous situation. If you have the president of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union getting together and there's no one else in the room. I mean, that would not happen under Biden, I'm quite sure. With regard to the Middle East, it's more complicated, I think. I would be surprised if the kind of transactional politics that's been carried on under Trump would be carried on at least to the same degree under Biden. I think there'd be more pressure placed on Israel to slow down the settlements or to really suspend the settlements and try to move to some kind of policy, negotiated policy with the Palestinians, although that'll be very difficult. I think there'll also be I don't know how to put it, a less endorsement of dictators. I mean, one of the things that's most dangerous about Trump's foreign policy is, if you look through it, he's basically aligned himself with the worst possible dictators against the former allies of the United States, namely the Western democracies. I mean, that has implications, I think, that haven't been spelled out. And I think that would change under Biden as well, if that makes sense. Does that meet some of your concerns?
Thank you so much for your insights. It was very valuable.
I appreciate it. I have to say, you guys have been great. These are terrific questions you're raising. You know, better than in some of the professional organizations, I assure you, with professional meetings. Yeah.
Good to know.
True.
If there's any further questions, if not, I think we'll end it here. If you're right with that, Dr. Bronner.
That's totally fine. Totally fine.
Thank you again for your time.
It's been my pleasure, actually.
Thoroughly enjoyed the lecture, and the Q&A afterward was quite interesting.
I wish you all the best. Good luck.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
And yeah, thank you for the lecture, everyone. Thank you for attending. And then I think we'll end it here. So.